Welcome to the Cannabis Innovators Show. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today we have an exciting interview because our guest works with ArcView, a leading investment group focused 100% upon the cannabis industry. ArcView members have financed over 150 deals with over $130 million invested in this emerging sector. Sumit Mehta is founder of Masakali and the strategy and finance consultant to the ArcView group. Sumit, welcome to the show. How are you?
Wonderful, Michelle. Thanks for having me this morning.
I know that you see a very large number of potential investments every quarter, and you probably say no to about 99% of them. What is the number one most important thing that you consider when entrepreneurs approach you with a deal or an idea?
Sure. We do see a large number of deals, Michelle. We see close to 30 deals a week. And while we have a host of criteria that we look at when deciding whether or not to work with or invest in any one of these deals, if you're asking me to isolate the one thing we look for, I would have to lean towards the founders themselves. Certainly, all things being equal, we do look for grit and tenacity and authenticity and purpose and the ability for a founder to overcome the various obstacles that a startup invariably faces, including having a high tolerance for ambiguity. So in an environment where all things are equal, we would choose to bet more on the jockey than on the horse.
That's very interesting. We hear that across the board in almost every industry. It's not the idea, it's the person behind it.
Well, an idea is only as good as it can be executed.
What are the biggest pitfalls that you have encountered so far? Are they products that do not succeed or services which are not adopted by consumers?
I think we've seen a healthy amount of both. I think in any high growth space, we see a lot of innovation, and in any space that exists, such as the cannabis space, which essentially is a moat that has been created by federal regulation around the cannabis castle, we are seeing a very healthy amount of innovation. And with that innovation, we certainly also see a healthy amount of failure. But I don't know that I can delineate between products or services in terms of where we're seeing more success. We are seeing a healthy amount in both.
When you say the federal government has created a moat, could you expound upon that just a little bit from your perspective?
Sure. We have a situation in our industry that does not exist in any other industry. And that is that if you are a cultivator, a distributor, a testing facility, or a retailer, you are a licensed cannabis company, but you don't have the services of ADP for payroll, as an example, or JP Morgan for banking, or State Farm for insurance, because the federal stance on this plant has kept those companies away from this industry. So as a result, you have innovators that come in and attempt to provide payroll, insurance, and banking services. Those are just three amongst hundreds that I could mention. And that is what I'm referring to when I talk about the moat around the cannabis castle.
So it's actually the creation of a whole new world.
There are 12,000 licensed businesses in the U.S. and 18,000 ancillary businesses in the cannabis space today.
Wow. What are some of the most successful sectors that are really hot right now in terms of edibles, medicinals and research, or in terms of ancillary products?
The spaces that are providing the most return at the moment are the cultivation spaces and any technology that can help drive down the cost of cultivation. Now, the price of this plant is extremely high, and we have seen retail prices, as an example, in 2016, top $5,000 a pound. This compares to the national average price of spinach at $3.83. And perhaps a closer comparison is the cousin of the cannabis plant, the hop plant, which retails at $7 a pound. So certainly there is a large room for price decline in the space, and cultivators are continually looking for ways to reduce their cost of cultivation. As a result, the hottest sectors that we are seeing are in cultivation at the moment, but certainly in agricultural technology and technology that can assist in reducing the cost of cultivation, both from an energy as well as a labor perspective.
That is such a huge range of price.
It certainly is a large range. If you look at the price of extract, it retails at $1,400 an ounce, and that compares to $1,250 for an ounce of gold. And I would also point perhaps to cannabis oil. If you look at the price of a barrel of oil, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $45 today. But if you look at a barrel of cannabis oil, its retail value is $5 million. And one can see how there's certainly a very large amount of room for that price to go, to where ultimately I believe that agricultural margins across all cultivation options for farmers will become normalized.
It's just such a huge margin when you think about computers way back when, how expensive they were and how huge they were size-wise, and how small they've gotten and how inexpensive they've gotten. And you compare it to the cannabis sector, you can really see where the fortunes are going to be made.
Yeah, the cost of certainly, I think that's a fair analogy. The cost of cultivation is in the $700 to $1,000 range, and we are seeing a very large amount of technological innovation as we have 2017 technology meet 10,000-year-old plant. And while we are looking at a very high cost of cultivation today, we're also at the same time finding that there's a tremendous amount of innovation to impact both the energy as well as the labor contributors to that cost of cultivation. And we are looking at bringing down that cost from the $700 to $1,000 a pound range down to the $250 to $350 a pound range.
You know, Sumit, not a lot of people are talking about this, but is the legal supply meeting consumer demand? I mean, we're hearing that in Canada, possibly when California becomes fully legalized also, there are possibilities of there being a huge shortage in the product. Would you agree with this?
Certainly. If we look at the legal market today, it's at a little over $7 billion. And if we look at the demand side of the equation, one can get to $80 billion. So I would surmise that the legal market today is able to supply roughly 10% of the market demand.
Only 10%?
As we stand right now, the growth of this industry is not a growth rate that's tied to increase in demand as much as it is legalizing demand that already exists. So the growth is not in other industries. One sees growth driven by adoption. We certainly saw that with home video and basic cable in the 80s. And we certainly have seen that with broadband adoption in the early 2000s. This industry is different in the sense that we are not creating consumer demand. We are simply looking to legitimize the satisfaction of that demand with legal supply. As we pass more laws across more states, and we're now at 30 states with medical laws and 9, including DC, with adult use laws, we are legitimizing what has already existed and what has been a supply constraint from a legal standpoint in all of these areas. And I'm very happy to state that over 60% of Americans now have legal access to cannabis wherever they live.
Sumit, another subject hardly discussed is that now that cannabis companies are making money, they can start hiring lobbyists to get the agenda advanced. Is this actually foreseeable?
Well, it's not only foreseeable, Michelle, that is happening today. We have a tremendous amount of lobbyists that are representing cannabis companies in an effort to change laws such that those companies can legitimately perform business functions.
Could you give us some examples?
I don't want to name names, so I would avoid giving you examples, but I certainly can share that we are in touch with and have known of many lobbyists that are working on behalf of companies to represent their views in this industry.
Can you please tell us about your own personal background and how you became interested in the cannabis industry?
Yes, I started investing in the late 90s. I spent 20 years on Wall Street between 96 and 2016, working for companies such as Raymond James, Merrill Lynch, UBS, and most recently JP Morgan. As I was looking at investing in various spaces over the course of that time, I came across the cannabis space in 2013 and started making my first investments in 2014. I found that over the next couple of years of learning the players, the industry, and the companies themselves, it became apparent to me that this is not just an industry, and the lens I was using, which was a pure ROI lens, was not adequate. And I realized that this is a movement. It is a space that has major implications for a lot more than just an investment perspective. It has major implications for our food, our fuel, our fiber, our paper, our medicine, our environment. And I haven't even touched on the social justice, the civil rights, or the cognitive liberty issues. And when I realized all of that, I also realized that it was not enough for me to just put my money into the space. I felt compelled and do every day to add my time and effort. And that is what drove me to leave JP Morgan and leave a 20-year Wall Street career to come into the cannabis space with the launch of Masakali.
Wow. Now, Sumit, what is Masakali? What does this mean and what does it do?
Masakali is a Sanskrit word. It's one of the 17 richest words in the history of language, and it takes 8 English words to describe it. Those are aspiring to fly higher through peace and liberation. We chose Masakali both for the meaning that it has to drive this industry forward in a responsible manner, but also as a nod to the history of this plant that goes back over 10,000 years to the base of the Hindu Kush Mountains, and as one of the plants that was recognized in the ancient Hindu text, the Atharva Veda, as one of the 5 most sacred plants of India. Masakali as a company works exclusively in the cannabis space. We help companies prepare themselves to receive capital. We also help investors prepare to place capital. With the backgrounds that we have, we are keenly aware of the impact that cannabis as an alternative investment class can have on an overall portfolio. And we work to help investors drive positive risk-adjusted returns through exposure within the cannabis space.
So you work both with the investment side and also with the entrepreneurs themselves?
We are entrepreneurs. We are investors. We work with both parties and help to promote this industry and move it forward in a responsible and ethical manner.
Moving to ArcView, what is the ArcView Group as an organization? Please tell us how it was formed and how it operates.
The ArcView Group was founded in 2010 by Troy Dayton and Steve D'Angelo with the intent of using the power of business to change the laws in the country that were so barbaric as it related to the cannabis plant. As it stands today, the ArcView Group is a collection of over 625 high net worth accredited investor members that, as you mentioned earlier, have placed $130 million into close to 150 companies. And the ArcView Group also, in addition to facilitating these investments, hosts 5 forums a year where companies can come and pitch to the investors that also attend to find new and innovative and attractive cannabis investment opportunities.
Is it just in the United States, or do you cover Canada and other international companies?
We went to Cannabis this year. That was it's the largest cannabis conference in Barcelona. We were there in March. We also went to Toronto over the summer, and the Canadian markets, as you may be aware, are the deepest and most liquid capital markets for cannabis in the world. And it's fascinating to go, I certainly will share that it's fascinating to go to a G7 country, the 10th largest economy on the planet, where the federal government has announced their intention of legalizing this plant by July of 2018, and that changes the construct for the industry in a way that is not possible in the U.S. today.
Wow. Could you please elaborate on that?
When you have federal support, you have support from industry that you don't have in the U.S. And we touched earlier in this interview on how the state farms and ADPs and JP Morgans are kept away from this industry because of the federal stance on cannabis in the U.S. Well, that's not the case in Canada. And as a result, there is a large amount of investment being made, certainly by the public, in companies that now have, as a result, produced the first billion-dollar market cap company in cannabis in the world that trades on the Toronto Stock Exchange.
That's huge. Going back just a bit to the pharmaceutical side of it, I want to touch on something we're seeing. We're starting to see that the severe injuries that athletes suffer becoming more and more prominent in the mainstream news. I know that there is an escalating amount of research and development of cannabis companies invested in products for athletes. Have you encountered these? And if so, do you think that it helps the credibility of marijuana here in the United States?
Certainly have encountered a large number of athletes that have used cannabis effectively for pain management. We have, as an example, at the ArcView Group, 4 former NFL players, all of whom are very outspoken in their support for this plant. I do think it helps the credibility tremendously. I think as we are learning more about this plant and about its uses for the endocannabinoid system, for the human condition, we're also embracing how effective it can be for many of the ailments that athletes suffer without many of the side effects that they're currently subjected to, given their bag of opioids they get when they join their leagues.
Which is a wonderful thing to see.
Absolutely wonderful. It's back to nature, it's back to whole plant medicine, and it's away from the pharmaceuticals that have been wreaking a fair amount of havoc on human health.
You know, in a survey of producers, nearly 100% said that they need to and plan to enlarge their grow facilities. We know that banks cannot lend money to growers, and traditional funds are probably not possible at this point. How accessible are funding groups, or is it just a few boutique operations at this time, such as the ArcView Group?
Certainly, Michelle, when we look back a couple years, we do see a large number of startups having been self-funded. That number has come down quite a bit. And as we look at a lot more companies being formed this year in cannabis, we're also seeing a lot more capital come into the space. So to your question on accessibility for funding groups, I will say that while there has been a relative lack of organized groups, there is no shortage of capital that's looking to come into the space. We are seeing, as we climb up the steps of the capitalization ladder, we are seeing folks move from that self-funding and that friends and family round to angel groups and investor groups such as the ArcView Group, but also opening themselves up to a couple of other funding sources, not the least of which is crowdfunding, made available to the industry and to the startup community at large by the Jobs Act that was passed last year. We're also seeing a healthy amount of interest from family offices, from private equity groups, and more recently than not, I've been very pleased to get exposure to interest from venture capital groups as well. So while traditional funding may not be available, and while the public markets in the U.S. are relatively closed, the industry is enjoying a healthy amount of capital that is looking to come in and place responsible bets on the growth of this space.
That's awesome.
It's very nice to see. It's certainly capital, like water, finds its level, and nature, I think business like nature also abhors a vacuum, and we are seeing capital come in and business fill the space to drive this industry forward.
Now, something very exciting. We have heard that California wants to open its own bank to fund marijuana deals. And I know that you personally are involved in this process on a very high level. Can you please explain your own involvement and give us an update on the progress so far?
Sure. California has taken the lead in creating a bank working group led by State Treasurer John Chang. And that working group is looking to find ways to implement banking solutions for California businesses, given the inability for banks to provide federally covered services to their depositors. And by that, I mean FDIC insurance. One of the key tenets that was put in place after the savings and loan crisis certainly is not available to banks that bank cannabis deposits, not to mention that these banks are also subject to AML and KYC laws that make it very difficult for them to open accounts. So I will applaud the efforts of the California Treasury Department. I was fortunate enough to be able to go down to LA to one of the last meetings that they had and testify in front of the state treasury on regulations I thought would be appropriate for banking in this industry. But I will say that that California has certainly taken a lead role in implementing some of the procedures that they have been contemplating, and I'm excited to see what that ends up looking like.
Do you have any idea of the timeline for this? Could this be next year? Could this take 10 years? What is your take on it?
The cannabis industry traditionally has not been able to be banked, and while we look at the number of banks serving the industry, we're still at a little shy of 300 banks that are friendly to the industry. This is up from 50 a couple of years ago. But given that we have 5,028 banks in the US today, we're still looking at a very small percentage that are even friendly to the industry. I would say that given this lack of banking historically, most of the business in the space has been conducted in cash, and California, similar to any other state that is legalized, is certainly eager to capture tax revenue from this commerce, and the implementation of a bank that can be trusted by participants in the space is crucial to being able to capture those tax revenues effectively. So while I don't have a sense for timeline, there certainly is a large amount of interest in getting a banking solution implemented sooner than later.
That's a huge amount of money for whoever is successful to implement this.
There could be up to $100 billion in cash in California from the cannabis space that would love to make its way into the legal system, but needs to be assured that there is adequate protection against a federal seizure before it does so.
So there's a lot of incentive to do so. What are the biggest blocks?
Well, every bank has to register with the federal government with a master account number, and as such, they are subject to FinCEN authority. But that's one of the blocks. With or without state insurance, one can get around the FDIC issue. But again, by not obtaining FDIC insurance, you're also opening yourself up to having depositors worry about the safety of their deposits. Another issue is the anti-money laundering laws and the know your customer laws. I mentioned the AML and KYC policies earlier. Those are issues that are difficult to get around, given that the source of capital deposits in these banks is from an illicit substance per the federal government.
I see. So it's a little tricky still at this point.
It's extremely tricky, to say the least.
Shifting gears, what are some of the most exciting technologies that are helping to drive down prices for growers?
If one looks at the cost of cultivation and the drivers of that cost, the largest driver to the tune of 30 to 40% is energy, followed by labor. When one looks at innovations and technologies driving down prices, I'll address both of those spaces. On the energy side, we are seeing multi-grid power solutions that can employ a combination of solar panels and on-site natural gas power generators. And these technologies are helping drive down the price of energy. I do suspect over time that the cultivation itself will move from an indoor space into an outdoor space, perhaps with a greenhouse and light deprivation technology, as we cannot continue to compete with the power of the sun. And I can't think of any other plant that is grown, that 90% of which is grown indoors today. On the labor side, we certainly are seeing a good combination of artificial intelligence and robotics to provide trimming solutions that can trim, for example, to the accuracy of 10 microns, and that's smaller than the width of a human hair. And that replaces labor costs that currently are at roughly $200 a pound down to $15 to $18 a pound. So one can see a large and meaningful impact, certainly with the advent of technology, on both the electric consumption as well as the labor cost for cultivation facilities.
So as many people see and have a perspective that cannabis is a world unto itself, in actuality, it opens up the entire world for the new technologies such as artificial intelligence, accounting, mainstream stuff, combined with the leading edge type of new world technology. It's incredibly exciting.
We certainly have the opportunity to take a leading role in innovation in agricultural technology. We have, as we've mentioned, very high prices and therefore high margins. And while these margins are not permanent, they are currently high, which allows cultivators to invest in technology that can help reduce the cost of cultivation while increasing its efficiency.
Sumit, we're beginning to hear that cannabis will very likely be a strong political issue in the 2020 elections in the United States. Would you agree with this? And please explain your perspective.
When I look at the political landscape today, I see 30 states that have medical laws. I see 9 states, including DC, with adult use laws. I see 13 states with pending legislation, and I see 43 countries with decriminalization legislation as well. I see a global force that is going to make it politically unfeasible to oppose legalization. I see the construct of the House and the Senate changing such that this will be a hot issue in the next election, certainly an issue that is bipartisan. We are now seeing north of 60% support across the country. And I will say that when we look back over 100 years in this country, and we look at states' rights issues that ultimately resulted in a federal response, one can see the feds responding within 3 to 5 years of any states' rights issues that got to a 60% plus support level. I can cite examples of civil rights, women's rights, and gay rights as 3 examples of what I'm describing.
We've heard so many huge estimates on what the industry could bring to the world as far as numbers go, investment-wise, production-wise. What do you foresee? Is this actually going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, or could it go higher?
Well, it is a multi-billion-dollar business, and I suspect it will remain a multi-billion-dollar business. When one looks at the current state of the market, the legal industry is estimated at $7 billion. That is the sum total of cannabis sold legally in the country. It does not count cannabis sold illegally in the country, which could be 10 times the amount of legal cannabis, nor does it count for every dollar spent on cannabis, the $5 or so that are spent around cannabis. So when one looks at the total amount of cannabis-related spend, one has to also include all of the technology and machinery used for cultivation, all of the devices used for consumption, certainly all of the transportation used for distribution, and the equipment used for testing, not to mention all the professional services that the industry employs and enjoys as a result. So when I look at what the total amount of the industry size could be, I can certainly get to a number north of $100 billion.
This is going to bring the world together as far as not just innovation goes, but as far as huge profit.
Certainly. I think that one of the analogies that you'd shared earlier was an analogy to the technology industry, and I'll share a couple thoughts there. When we look at the growth of this industry, and we look at an annualized growth rate of close to 30%, we only see one other industry that has grown faster than this in the last 100 years. We went back and we looked at the adoption of home video and basic cable and broadband, and we found that the only industry that has grown faster than the cannabis industry was broadband adoption. So it seems that Americans like cannabis more than anything else, perhaps with the exception of Wi-Fi.
Which we can't live without.
We can't live without, and perhaps we need Wi-Fi to order the wonderful cannabis that is delivered to our doors today. But when I look at this phenomenon, I have a couple of takeaways. The first is that the cannabis industry is the first large industry to be born in the information age, given that the last great industry was born in the industrial age. And the second implication is that as we look at technology, when we looked at technology in the late 90s, we looked at technology as an industry. We now cannot imagine an industry that does not employ technology. So technology went from being its own industry to being a part of every industry. And I see the cannabis space following the same path because of its large impact on all of our basic senses. So when I see cannabis finally being opened up to the world, of course, the first arrivals are from food, liquor, pharma, and tobacco, but I don't see the hospitality industry or the entertainment industry far behind. And as we go from surround sound in theaters to THC sound, one can imagine how ubiquitous this plant will be across all sectors in our society.
THC sound, what does that mean?
Well, cannabis has the unique ability to impact all of our senses, and as we are able to employ cannabis use in movie theaters, at concert venues, in restaurants, etc., we will be able to open ourselves up to a world of experience that in in most instances, we have been hiding out of public sight to employ and enjoy.
Oh, wow, the enhancement of the senses. So you're speaking of the enhancement of our senses on a commercial basis.
Absolutely. We are seeing wineries in Sonoma repurposing themselves into holistic healing and meditation centers with cannabis and food cultivation. We are seeing the collision of globalization, technology, and the wellness movement. And we're also seeing a shift in what we value as a society. And I can go into that last statement in more detail if you'd like.
Yes, please.
When I look at the agrarian age, the primary desire for humans was the accumulation of land, which then changed as we got into the industrial age with the desire shifting to the accumulation of capital and equipment. We then moved into the services age, and we had a tremendous amount of focus on software, on patents, on things that were scalable. And I think as we now enter a new age where we are able to dispense with a lot of the traditional employment opportunities and have technology replace them, I suspect we are moving towards the knowledge human age, where the concept of collaboration, compassion, compatibility, and consciousness, all lessons we learn from this plant, I believe are going to become extremely important as we continue to do business with more strangers across greater distances and have to build longer bridges of understanding across deeper chasms as a result.
This is so, just to use a term, new age.
It's a 10,000-year-old plant. We are rediscovering it, and I suspect that as we move past this 80-year period of prohibition, we certainly will look back and think of it as an absolute aberration of rational thought.
Sumit, this has been an amazing interview. How can our listeners get in touch with you and connect with both the ArcView Group and Masakali?
I certainly would point to our websites, masakali.com and thearcviewgroup.com, as places to start.
Sumit, thank you so much for being on the show.
Michelle, thanks so much. Appreciated the questions. This was certainly very, very insightful.
Yes, it has been. Sumit Mehta, strategy and finance consultant at ArcView Group and founder of Masakali. For the Cannabis Innovators Show, I'm Michelle Holliday at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com.